Who else can we involve in systematic reviews, other than review authors, of course? Let's talk about the real value of qualitative evidence synthesis. It lies in stakeholder engagement. The actual value of a qualitative evidence synthesis is often described in terms of its relevance, of the insights to further guide policy and practice decision-making processes, either as a standalone product or as complementary to the effects described in quantitative review projects. In this short presentation, I want to take you on a small journey of discovering the real value of QES. And I'm going to start by unraveling the term stakeholder. People are said to hold a stake in a consortium's work when they have contributed to the work and therefore also should gain the credits and ownership over it, but also when the output of our work affects them. For instance, changes to the length of a school day would not only affect the children themselves, but also teachers, parents, bus drivers, and so on. Or when the European Union decides to ban all plastic from the supermarkets to reduce waste, it affects the client, but also the distribution sector and the food production sector. So inclusive approaches to decision making would allow these stakeholders a say in any decision, either by expressing their opinions or as a co-participant in the process leading to a decision. The whole idea or focus on models of participation is related to a shift in political thinking, which translated itself into new organizational models of decision making, where we moved from an authority-based system of approaching problems and finding solutions for them towards a more networked approach to tackling challenges together, where the principle of equal intelligence of different stakeholders gradually becomes more embraced by policymakers, managers, and researchers themselves, including author teams from systematic reviews. This whole movement also challenged the idea that researchers and professionals are the sole holders of relevant expertise. But it also refers back to the ethical principle of do good and not harm. Make sure that whatever you produce as a researcher, a reviewer, or someone in the position to make change is beneficial to those affected by it. And this principle has been endorsed by international organizations such as the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Secondly, it also refers to the level of respect for citizens to make an informed choice based on their own understanding of what is right in a particular situation. For example, the evidence of a qualitative evidence synthesis on experiences of parents raising a child with Down syndrome might reveal severe challenges and pressure on the life of parents and siblings, which may push certain clinicians into proposing prenatal screening for the syndrome in the early weeks of a pregnancy. Still, we should respect future parents' choice not to do so, particularly in the absence of a clear state of mind about what needs to be done when the test turns out to be positive. Engaging stakeholders in reviews certainly has its benefits. It definitely buys in your target group's community into the review findings through that sense of ownership we talked about that is usually created during the review process. It increases the likelihood that people experience the results as credible. You can also better anticipate controversies, opposing viewpoints on what is most relevant to consider in terms of questions, subgroups, settings that might be taken along, building blocks of the logic model, or getting a sense of particular cultural historical framings that might need to be considered. In essence, Stakeholders help you unlock your blind spots more easily, and in return, you offer transparency and insight in the process. You make the process more democratic. Sometimes stakeholders also encourage teams to take on board a particular question that is timely for them and therefore also beneficial for review teams to look into, as it increases the visibility of the review and stimulates further uptake of the results in practice and policy. More nuanced framings and refinement of the scope of reviews by stakeholders also improves their quality. Last but not least, engagement with stakeholders also leads to more interesting discussions about evaluation markers, context to consider, to make the qualitative evidence richer in nature. What review authors find challenging is the amount of time it costs to engage stakeholders, particularly when they enter the review process at multiple points in time. Also, the stakeholders themselves found it challenging to combine the work for the review with family and professional business. Many review authors lack the skills or appropriate training to manage stakeholder involvement, and some had difficulties explaining the general idea of an evidence synthesis to volunteers who might come in with different expectations. Sampling the right stakeholders, either individuals or representatives that could speak on behalf of the target group, was challenging. So foresee perhaps some financial compensation for them to acknowledge them for their time or other benefits. It was also challenging to keep the scope of the review and to explain to people that not all insights can be taken along. Don't consider them as a homogeneous group. Think about who might make a difference in which phase of your review. The stakeholders can be involved in all or in very specific phases of a research project or a review, both quantitative or qualitative. What you see here on slide is an outline from the stakeholder engagement process from Kristin Liapo and colleagues in her review on interventions to support looked after children in school. She hardly reports anything about this process in her actual review, but the figure outlines the 4 steps in her review process to which citizens participated. They helped define questions and helped refine inclusion criteria on the protocol level. They also helped in building an accurate search strategy that captured the nuances of the intervention discussed and assessed studies for their relevance to the UK context, for example. And the collaboration was extended beyond the actual review process, as she engaged citizens in the whole process of disseminating the results, even at congresses. I'd like to show you an example of a review in which we engaged stakeholders in a mixed method systematic review on promoting hand washing and sanitation behavioral change in low and middle income countries. We chose to do so on the level of developing the theory of change that would guide us in developing the right outcome measures and in identifying factors or actors influencing the move towards behavioral change, which was key to decreasing the number of bacterial infections related to hygienic practices in these countries. This was our first logic model based on the literature. And a necessary condition to achieve the long-term impact of decreasing mortality rates is that the target population would first be reached. And this is facilitated, for example, by the availability of resources, an organizational network, and attention for cultural aspects that may positively influence recruitment. Once the population is reached, we can work on their abilities to recognize risks, attitudes towards hygienic measures, norm patterns, and self-regulation to achieve the desired behavioral change. And that change could be described as the intention to wash, the use of sanitary facilities, and habits to continue these efforts over time. Again, whether or not that change is achieved is influenced by many factors, like religion, ethnicity, social capital, the absence of an enabling environment, safety issues, and so on. Let me talk you through our process of stakeholder engagement. This draft theory of change was circulated electronically to stakeholders in preparation for a face-to-face meeting with the review team members and the stakeholders, 13 participants in total. The meeting was held from 10 to 12 February 2016 in Cape Town, South Africa. The stakeholders that were not able to join the face-to-face meeting provided their feedback electronically. During the first meeting day, we held presentations concerning the project plan, WASH and behavioral change, systematic review methodology, and theory of change development. These were provided by different team members and stakeholders. In addition, definitions for interventions and outcomes mentioned in the TOC were also presented, discussed, and finally approved by all meeting participants. Following a short explanation of the theory of change development in general and how the theory of change was developed so far, a workshop was initiated with the main aim of improving and refining the current logic model and making it more relevant for our different stakeholders and target groups. This is the theory of change that came out of the stakeholder engagement process. The added value of involving people who knew the context within which the intervention had to take place were manifold. It helped us to translate definitions into something that was better understandable by laypersons, by stripping it from medical and scientific jargon. We made a clearer distinction between short-term, mid-term and long-term outcomes. If results were reached early in the process, it would motivate people to continue. Contextual factors and factors influencing implementation were refined and also extended. For example, people mentioned that the caste to which people belonged also influenced whether they would buy into an intervention or even receive access to infrastructure. Also, we split up the dimension use on the level of behavioral change into hand washing, latrine use, faces disposal, and open defecation. We spotted some gaps in the literature as well on the level of research evidence available supporting the different components of the model. So stakeholders wanted to know for which elements of the theory of change the evidence was already robust. Icons were also added for clarity of presentation. The process that you've witnessed on our TOC or theory of change was quite streamlined. Well prepared. The boundaries within which people could provide input were narrow. So this fixed review methodology process determined the course of the review process considerably. This is why we need to consider other forms of input and perhaps move away from the idea of seeing stakeholders' input as labor or as part of a collaborative process. We could move towards a strategy in which we collect with people and open up a space for negotiation and extensive social relationship. We could stretch that freedom on the side of the stakeholders. To collect is to listen to the other members of the collective and be willing to change what you know and thus who you are accordingly. To collect does not require each member of the collective to strive towards a preset goal. When collecting, interest in and responsibility towards the other should be balanced with respect of the other's difference and individual needs more than your own as a review team. End this presentation with a couple of practical questions that you can consider when you consider stakeholder involvement. For example, what judgment about your qualitative evidence synthesis are you willing to share with others? Is it the framing of your question or sub-questions? Is it definitions and key concepts and their relative importance for people? Where to look for relevant evidence? What the findings might mean? Do the stakeholders get a role in your analysis, for example? And how can we report the findings in a way that speaks to these people? Who are the stakeholders who can help make these judgments? Are they members of an organization? Are they individuals of their own or representatives of particular groups? Also, where should we meet up with them? In our own offices? In their community? Perhaps in a car if there's a risk that they are exposed beyond their own will? Who in the review team has the skills to consult or collaborate with stakeholders? What advanced information would help them prepare for discussions in the review process, for example? How much time is there for discussion? What costs will be accrued? For travel, for refreshments, for honoraria of the people who participate? Do we have that available? How will stakeholders' contributions be acknowledged in the review report, particularly when we consider them co-creators of our process? And now it's your turn. How are you going to involve your stakeholders?